Hello, Susan Corbett, custom machine quilter here with this delightful quilt that will go on the wall of my client's quilting room. It's a wool applique on cotton. And as usual, I started out by outlining the applique, and I did some ditch quilting in between borders. And then I got to this last third row of blocks and I thought, well, let's just combine the straight line work with the outlining of the applique, because that just seemed like the way to go. And that's kind of indicative of what happened on this quilt. I didn't have a game plan in mind, except when I was with the client, I just wanted to quilt along those lines of the background fabric. This is cotton fabric. It's diawabo. It looks like linen. It's a woven, a loose weave kind of fabric. Normally around applique, I'd like to do something very showy, ornate, elaborate. But my client doesn't really care about things like that. So I thought, well, the quilt I had quilted previously has the same fabric, and the lines worked so well in there, I thought, well, the lines will probably work really good here. The only question for me was what the scale of the lines, how far apart, where exactly. So the increment is about 5/8 to 3/4, which I think isn't enough, but it seemed to work out on this quilt. So I just went with it. And this is part of how you let the quilt tell you how it wants to be quilted. I've read so many times, the work knows far more than I do. So it's just a matter of listening. So all I knew initially was that I wanted to outline everything and do lines in the background, just to keep it simple. So the applique could be the star of the show, and it is. So there were other elements of the quilt where I waited and waited. I find that, if I find ditch quilted, or, just start with what I know I want to do, and then some idea will pop into my head for how to do the rest of it later. And that is what happened here. So I'll get to the other parts a little bit farther down the road. So I started quilting with, I've got a neutral color of So Fine in here. So I've outlined the applique and done the straight lines in that color thread first. And then I went back and changed thread color to fill in a bunch of little details. The thread is going to want to sink into the pile of the wool. So a lot of times I can get away with not changing thread color, but see, a light colored background thread on the red, on the dark brown, that wasn't going to work. So when I know I'm going to change thread color, which happens a lot in custom quilting, I like to start out with the predominant thread, what there is going to be most of, what thread will be used in the greatest quantity, and start there. So I get as much anchoring and quilting done as possible before, for example, before turning a quilt. I'm trying to think if I turned this quilt. I think maybe once. And usually I turn it to get to the borders. I want as much access to the border as I can get all at one time. All right, so one facet of this background quilting is, you know, I ended up just freehanding these straight lines. The first time I read that in a book, I was appalled. I just thought it can't be done. You have to have a ruler. But sometimes you really don't. So with a loose weave fabric like this that's not going to be quilted very heavily, you know, like if you just take your finger and pull some of the fullness out of the way and then let the quilting take up that extra fullness, works really well. I didn't have to struggle with this at all. I mean, things just pretty much fell into place without much manipulation of the fabric. I was grateful for that. And one thing the client did that I thought was great, you know, I mean, I think the name of the game is contrast. Is there contrast here? And the way she positioned the lines in the background have a natural contrast to them. In this block, the lines are going horizontally. In the next one, they're going vertically. And that's good contrast. That worked out great. The fabric has its own kind of texture, so it didn't need texture in a way that would fight the texture that it already has. And so I would just start somewhere and go for it. And there were still a lot of stops and starts, but it seemed to kind of work out well. You know, outline here and then do some lines and then pick someplace else to go with them. And this turned out to be a pretty quick way to get this done. This quilt did not take forever. So it's a nice, simple, custom quilting scheme, and anytime it can be not the biggest production, you know, that's a nice thing. That holds the price down, and the client doesn't have to wait for a long time, and it's not all the work in the world for me. One problem with this thread, well, maybe with my machine, let's call it that. My machine is persnickety. It likes for me to sew left to right. And if I want to sew right to left, the thread will break. And sew fine, being a thin thread, will break. That didn't happen too often here, but it did happen. So that kind of influenced my, you know, the order of things somewhat. See, I thought that fullness was going to cause a pleat, so I pushed the fabric out of the way and it took up the slack. One tricky part was remembering which line I was quilting between. It's helpful sometimes to take a picture of what you've done up at the top, so when you get down to the bottom, you can remember what it was you did up there. So see the border below. I was thinking, how am I going to quilt that frame? Because of course I'm going to quilt the frame. How am I going to quilt the little background around the spools? What am I going to quilt in the spools? That's what I was thinking over. Here's a thread break. Now, it doesn't look like I was quilting right to left. I mean, I was going up and down and sideways, and so I thought that would be okay, but no, the thread broke. Oh well. That's what happens. And here was also, I was thinking, okay, what am I going to do in those spools? What color thread am I going to use? And I started auditioning threads, and I ended up with a variegated. and it gave me all sorts of trouble. So I didn't use it in all the places I thought I was going to. The thread that's going to give you trouble, well, that gives me trouble, is cotton thread. Even if it's thick, sometimes it'll just get really persnickety. I'll have tension problems, or it'll break or something. So I didn't expect that thread because it's nice and thick, but no, I had trouble. I switched to a polyester and all that trouble went away. My current favorite thread at the moment is Omni by Superior, but really any other poly thread like it would be great. The cotton thread tends to be a lint fest, and it likes to break. I had only one client recently who said she demanded cotton thread. Most everybody else doesn't care anymore. When I first began long arming, I had all kinds of, I guess, distrust of the process of long arming. I had a lot more objections, and those have kind of gotten worked out over the years. I think more people have developed a kind of trust after all this time. Thank goodness. I realize I've said put the embellishments on last because you'll break them with that presser foot, and they're not breaking. That seems to violate this directive, but really, I've just gotten lucky lately. I can't believe they didn't break. I'm quilting inside those scissors. Those little details matter. If I blew it off and thought, oh, it doesn't really matter, it would look unfinished. Outlining in ditch quilting is extremely important. It needs to be there, but maybe not very visible. But to my eye, it's visible when it's not there. Do it and you get a nice anchored, tailored, thoroughly quilted quilt. I'm not a big fan of finding ways to cut corners. That always comes back to haunt. Custom quilting is a lot of trouble. That's kind of the name of the game here. And as you can see, there is a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's a fair amount of backtracking involved here, just to limit the stops and starts. It's easy for the presser foot to push the heavier thicknesses of wool out of the way, so often I use my hand to keep it in place or stick a pin in there some way to anchor it before I anchor it. I just love all the texture in this quilt. I did not quilt around all the embroidery. I didn't want to squash it, and this is not a heavily quilted quilt, so I would quilt on the applique just where I thought it needed it. Looking good. Okay, so I decided to keep going with the lines in the background of these cornerstones. I'm freehand outlining the circle. Putting in some straight lines for consistency's sake. And I love how that worked out. It got quilted from top to bottom and then back up to the top and then right into the next portion here. So by this time, I'd made some decisions about what was going to be where. So if I've got straight lines in the background up against that frame, what do I want in the frame? I ended up with a loop meander in the frame because I'm thinking, what does thread do? Like, I was looking for a theme here. Sewing and thread, and you know, thread loops around and it curls. So I ended up putting a little simple linear loop meander in the green frame between the body of the quilt and the border. And I decided to do some lines in the short spools. And when thread unspools, it makes loops. Really, I could have done anything in those rectangular patches there. But I like to have a rationale for what I'm doing. So, if I'm doing a big loop in the spool, then here in this little background, I want the quilting to be smaller. So what we're going to end up with is a long line across that green strip and some little round intricate things in between the spool and the frame, because I thought that would be good contrast. Simple, ornate. And here is a look at the finished quilt. Isn't that beautiful? All right. Well, I'm loving how the lines turned out in the background. They don't look too sparse. I think that's good because so many of the pieces in the applique are so big. So I think the scale works. So let's see. In the frame, you know, I never like to leave the frame unquilted. I think that's a great opportunity to really add one more lovely detail. So I did a loop meander in a variegated thread. None of the colors in the variegated are green, so that helps it look really good. You can see all the colors, but they're very subtle. And I did a pattern meander in the background of the spool border. I did lines in the smaller spools and those interlocking loops, which is a sashing design in the spools. And the spools are all different sizes, so there's different numbers of loops in there. In the outer border, I did a pattern meander version of a big meander, which I really like. I think that's good. It flows. So that's kind of fun. I did just some ruler work on the spool top and bottom. Just one big arch. The client said she was going to do some more, like there's buttons or something, I forget, going in the corners on top of those circles. So I did not quilt in the circles. I'm leaving that up to her. Which reminds me, so embellishments need to go on last. I got really brave about quilting over all the little buttons, and I mean, that was a risk. See how many buttons there are? There's just a lot. These buttons I did nothing with. I just pretended they weren't there because I didn't want the presser foot to destroy them. One time I had a quilt with a bunch of little seed beads, and the presser foot just disintegrated those things right and left. But all these buttons survived. I just quilted right over them. I mean, not through them, you know, around them. But no harm came to anything. Look at that great measuring tape. Isn't that fun? That's a really good detail here. So there were thread changes that are invisible. You can't see most of them, you know, hardly at all. I used some dark red, a little. I used some blue. Here in this patch, I quilted right around here and right around there, just to anchor it down because it was kind of big, and all the others had some quilting in them. You know, on the light blue one, all I did was outline the leaves. I did not quilt here because I didn't want to squash it. And that space in between all the scissors, I just thought cried out for a little motif. So I think that's really cute. This block is really plush. There's layers and layers. So just simple outline quilting around those pieces, I think, does that block a lot of good. That's beautiful. There was one block. Okay. So here, you know, to leave this guy empty or do some quilting. And I was going to leave it blank, but then I outlined those little yellow embroidery details. And I like the texture that gave that part. That was fun. This block had a bunch of thickness, but nothing that was unquiltable. That looks pretty good. The most, let's see, this block down here, this part, that is really thick. But I still managed to get in there and outline just about everything. And I think it looks great. Really nice. So, there it is. I didn't do a lot of recording of the process on here. I had many distractions this week. You know how that goes. But I think it's really beautiful, and she will love having that hung up on her wall of her quilting room. So, this is very inspiring to me, and I know it will be to everybody else. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.